Hi, I'm Erica with A Needle and Thread, and today we're going to talk about making a scrappy binding. My shop is part of the Northside shop hop here in Spring, Texas. All the shops that are participating are on the north side of Houston. For our quilt, each shop got to choose the way we finished it, the borders and the binding and such. And so I chose to take all of the fun fabrics that are inside the quilt and pull that out to make my binding. Here you can see some of the fun colors within the quilt, and then I have this nice speckly binding going all the way around the quilt that just references those colors that are within the body of the quilt. So what I want to do today is just kind of go through the steps how I went about making my binding. Depending on the amount of fabric that you have left after you've made your blocks, you can adjust the size of the strips that you want to use to make your scrappy binding. For the binding that I used on the shop hop quilt, I cut my pieces 6 inches by 2.5 inches, and I joined those end to end all the way around. Now normally when I cut binding, I'm cutting on the cross grain, selvage to selvage, and that usually yields me about 40 inches worth of fabric, usable fabric. So I can add 40 going all the way around, and I can come up with how much fabric I need. However, when I'm making scrappy binding, it's not as easy as that. For as much as I cut 6 inches, I'm not able to use that full 6 inches worth of fabric to add together to make the binding on my quilt. I actually yielded just over 3 inches worth of fabric to add together to make the binding of my quilt. And I'm going to show you exactly why I'm losing so much fabric in the process. When you join your strips of fabric together, you have 2 options in joining your strips. You can either join them end to end so that the straight edge, that straight 2.5 inch wide edge, butts up against the other 2.5 inch wide edge. I don't like to make my binding like that for a couple of reasons. One, when it comes to folding my binding in half, it leaves me with a thick area in my binding that I have to work to really get past. The bulk of the fabric at the seams is not distributed in a way that makes it easy for me to sew when I'm putting it on. Joining on the straight like that is not good. The other reason why it's not a good thing to do is because it doesn't give you a lot of give and movement. You're cutting your binding a lot of times on your cross grain. That's selvage to selvage of your fabric. Well, in doing that, you are able to get a little bit of give, a little bit of tug to it. But once you put a seam in the middle of it, that give and tug is gone. So the better option is to join your strips on the diagonal like this is. That not only gives you the play, a little bit of give because you're working with the bias edge, but it also gives you an opportunity to have the bulk of these seams distributed so that as you're sewing, you're not working through 8 layers of fabric at one time. It's a lot of fabric when your seams are on this straight. What I want to do now is show you exactly how I went about making this so that you can see how it ended up on my quilt. I have a bunch of just random scrappy pieces here that we're going to use. So when I'm doing my binding, when I'm joining them, I always make sure that one strip of binding fabric is face up and it is running horizontal to where I am, okay, side to side. My next piece I'm going to put face down like that and place it perpendicular to the one that's face up. I am going to overlap just a smidge on the top and on the side edge, and what that does, it gives me an opportunity to see exactly where the corner is. I will then place my ruler in the top left corner for me and the bottom right corner here and draw a line. That's going to be the line that I sew directly on. And I can just drop a couple of pins in and take it to my machine to sew. So now that I have it sewn directly on the line, I can check it by opening it out. And there I have my first 2 pieces that are actually put together. Once they're put together, then I can clip off this excess triangle on the outside. Make sure you're cutting on the outside of the line. You can cut it roughly a quarter of an inch. If it's a little bit more than a quarter, that's okay. If it's a little bit less, that's okay. But you really do want to make sure that you have about a quarter of an inch seam allowance that you've allowed for. And in flipping it this way, I now have 2 of my strips together. Now I'm going to just zip through and get the other strips put together so that you can see exactly how everything looks. Okay, so I went through and I marked and I pinned all of them. So now I'll go ahead and stitch them so we can have one continuous piece of binding. Okay, so we're all joined now. Let me clip them off with that rough 1/4 inch seam allowance. Notice as I'm cutting, I'm isolating the pieces that I want on my hand, and I'm putting the scissor in between my fingers and the fabric to keep from accidentally cutting any of my other pieces of fabric that make up the binding. Okay, so I isolate it on my hand and then cut with the base of the scissor on my fingers like that. So here we have the joined length of fabric for my test binding. Pressing at this point is really important. As we press, there's always the question, do we press to one side, press to the dark side, press to the light side, press it open? What do we do? In a situation like this, it is best to press your seams open. The reason for that is because we want to reduce the amount of bulk. If you push it all over to one side, then you're going to have a whole lot of bulk on this side and it's going to be low and flat on the other. If you press those seams open, then your binding is going to go on a lot more smoothly. So let's press those seams open. So I have all of my pieces stitched together, trimmed, and then I pressed them. You can see I pressed my seams open. The last step before I can apply the binding to my quilt would be to press it in half. Okay, so we're finished. That is the end of making this lovely scrappy binding that I can then put onto my quilt. You can use whatever colors you like, whatever colors seem to work with your quilt. But again, I did this one because of the shop hop quilt that the Northside quilt shops are doing for our shop hop next week. If you liked this video, you like the information that I have, you like the way that I teach, fantastic. I'm glad you do. Don't forget to subscribe below. All of the information, links to my shop and classes and what have you, that's going to be down in the description box below. Also, don't forget about the shop hop. If you're in the Houston area this next week, we are doing the shop hop from July 25th to the 27th. Information for that will be in the link below as well. I think that's all I have for you this time. I'll see you next time. Bye.